I want to start at the very beginning. It's a good place to start. Stephanie, what is the federal deficit?
Okay, it's the difference between two numbers, right?
Mhm.
It's this thing that you hear, you see headlines, media, hand-wringing, this word that's like omnipresent, right? And at the end of the day, it boils down to this rather benign thing. It's literally the difference between two numbers. One of the numbers is, how many dollars the government puts out there each year. So we call that outlays. If you go to the congressional budget report and you look up the tables, it'll say total outlays and it will give you a number. And those outlays could be for things like military spending, healthcare, infrastructure, and all that. So think of dollars flowing out of government. Okay, that's one number. The other number is total revenue. That's mostly through taxation. So it's how much the government collects in personal income tax, and corporate income tax, and payroll tax, and all that. So how much comes in each year. So the difference between what goes out and what comes in. So if outlays are greater than receipts, than revenues, then we record on the ledger a deficit. So putting really simple numbers to it, you guys, if the government, outlays are 100 and revenues are 90, then we call that a deficit and we record somewhere that the government has run a deficit. Somebody writes -10 on the books. Okay. So that's the definition. That's what we're talking about. But what we forget, and it's really, really important, and you would think somebody would take the trouble to mention this, is that if the government puts out more than it takes away from us, that it's really just making a deposit. So if it's puts 100 in and only takes 90 out, what it's really doing is depositing $10 into some other part of the economy. In other words, the government's deficit is always matched dollar for dollar by a financial surplus. On the other side of every deficit lies a surplus of equal size that goes into some other part of the economy. So when people get very upset at the notion that the government has done this awful thing called running a fiscal deficit, what they really failed to recognize, and it's partly due to the economics profession, which doesn't do a good job informing people, journalists, pundits, talking heads on TV, what people don't realize is that the government's deficit is a financial contribution to some other part of the economy. So in a financial sense, every deficit is good for someone. The question is, for whom? What are those deficits being used to accomplish? And who's on the other side of that windfall? Where are those dollars going? Who has them now?
So a lot of people think of the word deficit and they imagine their own household budget. If I take out a credit card and I spend a bunch of money on it, it's money I don't have. I have to pay that money back. Now, you make this great distinction that the government is not a household. We have a fiat currency. The US government's a currency issuer. I love that you say their red ink is our black ink to describe that. A lot of people hear deficit and assume debt. And moreover, they assume foreign debt, like we've taken out a credit card with the Bank of China. Can you make the distinction for everyone? Because it's unfortunately a super common one between foreign debt and the national deficit.
Yeah. Even, journalists and pundits and members
Yeah.
of Congress will sometimes conflate the deficit and the debt. And I have to tell you, Jessica, I wish we didn't use either of these words. I think both are poor words to use to describe what's really happening. So I would prefer to just use the term net spending for the outcome, whatever the difference between outlays and revenues is each year. We just call it net spending. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. The debt, so called, is the cumulative, right? The running total of all of the prior instances where the government engaged in net spending of a plus or minus kind. So let me give you an example. If the government puts in 100 and takes out 90, we've already established that we call that a fiscal deficit. We write -10. Now, if they do that year after year after year after year, we'll have a different number. We'll add up all those minus tens, and that will give us what we refer to as the so-called national debt. What happens is that each year the government's budget happens to end in a deficit. The government sells treasuries. These are financial instruments that are available to the rest of us, including to China. People who have dollars can trade those dollars in for what I think amounts to just another kind of dollar, right? It's an interest-bearing US dollar called a government bond, a US treasury. And so China has access to that market. You and I have access to that market, other investors, pension funds, and the like. And it's the total outstanding stock of US treasuries that we call the national debt. And that word is so loaded, right? Because people hear the word debt and they think, oh my God, I know if I took on trillions of dollars of debt, it would be the end of the world for me personally. But the federal government, as you just said, doesn't have a budget that operates like a household. This thing called the debt is not akin to personal debt. It doesn't work like when we take on personal debt. If you got yourself in a pickle with credit card debt, you've got to find dollars to repay your creditor, Visa, MasterCard, whoever. When the federal government sells treasuries, what is it obligated to pay at the end of the day? US dollars to bondholders. Well, where do US dollars come from? Well, it turns out the US government is the issuer of the US dollar. So it's a very different beast when we talk about debt for a household versus this thing that we unfortunately call debt for the federal government. What it really is just a financial asset for the rest of us. Part of our wealth, part of our savings. If you're lucky enough to own some of these, congratulations, right? This is a safe financial instrument that pays you interest for the benefit of parting with your dollars for some period of time.
That's a great distinction. And so when we think about the deficit being the difference between these two numbers, we think about the debt being these treasuries, right? Both of those are coming from the federal government. One thing that helped me when I first started learning about this is a visual that really kind of brings in this paradigm shift. And one of the classic ones for those that are learning this perspective, this lens into public budgets, is this classic sectoral balances image. Can you tell us a little bit about this image and what it's showing us?
Yeah. So what it's showing you, I'm going to just take one quick step back and say something else about the debt, so-called, which I think it's important to say. When I said it's the cumulative total. So what we want to recognize is that those are all of the dollars that the government has spent into the economy over the history of the country's existence and not taxed back. So that's what it is, right? It's the dollars that have been spent by government and not taxed back. It's really just part of the broader US money supply. Those treasuries are really interest-bearing dollars. They circulate, they function in many ways like money. So when you look at this graph, what do you see? All right, this is a graph. It's actual data. Nobody made this up, okay? This is real historical data going back to the 1950s, early 1950s. And what the graph does is to break the economy into three big chunks. Okay, we could disaggregate it further, but this makes the point pretty clearly and nicely. One chunk here that you see depicted in blue is the US private sector. That's all the households and all the businesses in the US economy, our private sector. What you see depicted in red here is the government sector. That's federal, state, and local. That's government here in the US. And then there's everything else, which is what's outside of the US. That's shown in green, and that's the rest of the world. So what the graph shows you is how dollars flow in and out of sectors over time. So if one part of the economy experiences net outflows, in other words, it pays out more dollars than come in during that period of time, you're going to see that sector below zero. It's going to have a deficit. if a sector is receiving more dollars than it is paying out, it's going to have a surplus, as you're going to see it above zero there. So the graph is neat and tidy, and it may strike people who are watching this that, wow, they're kind of a mirror of one another. And that's an important part of the story, because every payment that flows out of one sector has to go somewhere, right? And it has to be received by some other sector. So any deficit has to result in, as we said earlier, a surplus in some other part of the economy. And so everything has to net to zero. Another striking feature, remember, this goes back to the early 1950s, is that you notice the government is almost always in red. Government is almost always the one in the deficit position, whereas the private sector is almost always above zero with a surplus. And we don't have the time, I don't think, to get into the whole rest of the world and trade imbalances and why that changes over time. But the important point here is that those government deficits are the thing that is producing the surpluses that you see above zero. So if you just look, let's see how far back this goes. There you go. So you have the COVID spending, right? Those enormous deficits that were run to try to support the economy through the pandemic and so forth. And people really got concerned at the size of the government's deficit during that period. But if you look at this in the context of the whole picture, not just what's happening to the government's budget, but look up, right? Look what's happening to everybody else. And you'll see that those government deficits were instrumental in keeping the private sector afloat, right? So you can see that big spike in the private sector's financial surplus in that period. Well, those surpluses were made possible by virtue of the government outlays greater than receipts. So the government's deficit is producing those surpluses.
And I think what's really key that you mentioned is that this is not a fixed thing, but rather it's up for grabs, right? That deficit could be going to one place, to the most wealthy, the most powerful, to the military, whatever, or it could be going to the things we need to improve quality of life and improve the standard of living for working people, for communities of color, historically marginalized communities, whoever they may be, right? Like, it's a political question of where those deficits go, and I think that's so vital to understand.
And Andres, you're right for sure. And just to be clear, in the pandemic, they went to both places, right? They went to both. It wasn't as if Congress said, well, we're going to have to respond to this, health crisis and this economic crisis. And so we're going to make a commitment to, with the CARES Act, $2.2 trillion in March of 2020. They didn't say, I guess it's time to finally cut the military budget because we're going to have to, commit a lot of money to supporting the economy because of the pandemic and the economic fallout and so forth. No, they continued to fund, and even more generously so. When the Defense Reauthorization Act comes up, they put more money into the military and supported the economy with fiscal package after fiscal package after fiscal package, some 5 trillion, even more than 5 trillion in the span of about 12 months time.
Yeah. So, I mean, that really kind of, for the organizers and people in politics listening, right? Like, that just shows that it's up for grabs. And like AOC and some other public officials say, these budgets are in many ways moral documents that say, what do we want to prioritize?
You bet.
Something